When your own parents look at you with disgust on what should be the proudest day of your life, something inside you breaks that can never be put back together the same way. My name is Rebecca Mitchell, and 10 years ago, on my college graduation day, my mother told me I was an embarrassment to the family name. Not because of my grades, I graduated summa cum laude. Not because of my accomplishments. I had already secured a position at one of Portland's most prestigious architecture firms. No, she said I was a disgrace because of my face, because I didn't look like the daughter she wanted to parade in front of her society friends. My father nodded in agreement, his silence cutting deeper than any words. My younger sister Jessica smiled that cruel little smile I'd known my whole life, the one that said she'd finally won. That morning they handed me an envelope with a check for $5,000 and told me to disappear from their lives. They said the money was more than I deserved, considering how I'd humiliated them just by existing. I took that check, cashed it, and used every penny to start over in a city where no one knew the Mitchell name. For 10 years I built a life they knew nothing about. I changed my appearance, yes, but more importantly I changed everything about who I was on the inside. And when I walked into that courthouse last month, with my mother's pearls catching the light and my father's expensive suit looking suddenly cheap under the fluorescent glow, they smiled at me like I was still that broken girl they'd thrown away. They thought I'd come to beg. They thought I'd come to apologize for having the audacity to be born not beautiful enough for their standards. They had no idea I'd come to show them exactly what they'd thrown away, and more importantly, what they'd done to others just like me. They had no idea about the evidence I'd spent a decade collecting, or the lawyer sitting 3 rows behind me with a folder thick enough to bury their precious reputation forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The air inside the Multnomah County Courthouse tasted like old wood and broken promises. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the judge's bench. Every sound echoed in that space, the shuffle of feet, the rustle of papers, the quiet breathing of people waiting for justice or dreading it. I sat in the 3rd row on the left side, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of every eye that tried not to stare but couldn't help themselves. The Mitchell family had made headlines for weeks now, ever since the initial filing had gone public. Portland society loved nothing more than watching the mighty fall, and my parents had positioned themselves at the very top of that precarious mountain for as long as I could remember. My mother sat in the front row, her posture perfect as always, spine straight as if someone had placed a steel rod where her backbone should be. She wore cream, always cream or white or pale pink, colors that suggested innocence and purity and grace. Her hair was swept into that elegant twist she'd perfected decades ago. Not a single strand out of place, even though I knew she had to be terrified. But Patricia Mitchell had learned long ago how to wear a mask so convincing that even she believed it most days. Next to her, my father Robert sat with his hands clasped on his knee, his jaw set in that familiar expression of controlled disapproval. He was a man who'd built an empire on appearances, on the right handshakes and the right clubs and the right address. Everything in his world existed to be seen, to be judged, to be ranked and categorized and assigned value. And I had been the one thing in his perfectly curated life that didn't fit the image. Jessica sat on Mother's other side, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders, her face composed in an expression of supportive concern that I knew was as fake as the story they'd been telling about me for the past decade. She'd always been the beautiful one, the one who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, the one who made our parents glow with pride just by walking into a room. She wore navy blue today, probably on purpose, the color of trust and loyalty and steadfastness. Everything about their presentation had been calculated, choreographed, designed to tell the room that they were the victims here, that I was the unstable one, the ungrateful daughter who'd turned on her loving family. The gallery behind them was packed with reporters, their cameras ready, their notebooks open, hungry for whatever blood would be spilled today. I recognized faces from every major publication in Oregon, some from Seattle, even a few from California. The Mitchell case had become more than local news. It had become a symbol of something larger, something about family and cruelty and the price of perfection. Behind me, 3 rows back and slightly to the right, Daniel Foster sat with his leather briefcase on the seat beside him. He was younger than most people expected, barely 40, But he'd built his reputation on cases exactly like this one, cases where the powerful had crushed the powerless and thought they'd gotten away with it. When I'd first approached him 2 years ago with my story, he'd listened for 3 hours without interrupting, his face growing darker with each detail I revealed. At the end, he'd closed his notebook and looked at me with eyes that held both fury and something like hope. He'd said that if even half of what I told him was true, we could do more than win. We could change things. The bailiff stood near the judge's chamber door, his hand resting on his belt, his eyes scanning the room with professional detachment. He'd seen hundreds of cases, maybe thousands, and I wondered if ours looked any different to him than all the others. Did he see the way my mother's fingers trembled slightly before she hid them in her lap? Did he notice how my father's left eye twitched once, twice, 3 times, a nervous tic I'd learned to recognize as a child whenever he was about to lose his temper? Could he sense the weight of everything that was about to unfold? Or was this just another Thursday morning in a building full of broken families and bitter disputes? I'd barely slept the night before. My apartment in Southeast Portland was small but mine. Every piece of furniture chosen by me. Every photo on the wall representing a moment I'd chosen to remember. I'd sat by the window until dawn, watching the city wake up, thinking about the girl I'd been 10 years ago. That girl had believed, despite everything, that her parents might still love her underneath their disappointment. She'd thought that maybe if she just achieved enough, accomplished enough, proved her worth in ways that had nothing to do with her appearance, they might finally see her as valuable. She'd been wrong, of course. Some people only see what they want to see, and no amount of achievement can change that. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and everyone rose as Judge Victoria Hernandez entered. She was in her late 50s, with silver streaking through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that suggested she'd spent a lot of years deciding who was telling the truth and who was selling a story. She'd been assigned to our case randomly, or so the system claimed, but I'd done my research. Judge Hernandez had a reputation for having no patience for bullies, particularly those who used wealth and status as weapons. She'd grown up in East Portland, worked her way through law school while raising 2 kids, and had a particular interest in cases involving family exploitation. If there was such a thing as a favorable random assignment, this was it. She settled into her chair, adjusted her glasses, and surveyed the courtroom with the kind of thorough attention that made everyone sit a little straighter. Her eyes passed over my parents, lingered on me for just a moment, then moved to Daniel Foster before returning to the papers on her bench. The bailiff announced the case number. The words formal and strange, reducing years of pain and manipulation into a sterile legal reference. Mitchell versus Mitchell. A family name turned against itself. Blood fighting blood in the most public way possible. Judge Hernandez looked up from her papers, her gaze settling on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. There was something in her expression that went beyond professional interest, a flicker of recognition perhaps, as if she'd seen too many versions of this story and was tired of watching it play out. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the room, each word deliberate and weighted with the authority of her position. She asked if I was ready to proceed, if I understood the gravity of what we were about to undertake, if I was certain I wanted to move forward with allegations that would forever alter my relationship with my family. The subtext was clear. This was my last chance to walk away, to preserve whatever fragments of family connection might still exist, to choose silence over truth. I stood slowly, feeling the eyes of every person in that courtroom fix on me. My legs felt solid beneath me, stronger than they'd been in years. I'd spent a decade preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, documenting patterns, connecting dots that my parents had thought they'd scattered too far apart to ever be reassembled. I transformed myself not just physically but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. The girl who'd walked away from that graduation ceremony with a check and a broken heart was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that justice wasn't given freely, that it had to be fought for, earned, dragged into the light by people willing to risk everything to expose the truth. My voice didn't shake when I answered Judge Hernandez. I told her yes, I was ready. I told her I'd been ready for 10 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I told her that what we were about to reveal wasn't just about me, wasn't just about one family's cruelty, but about a pattern of behavior that had damaged countless lives. I told her that I understood the cost, that I knew exactly what I was sacrificing by standing in this room, and that I was willing to pay that price because some truths are too important to keep buried. When I finished speaking, the room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Judge Hernandez nodded once, a small gesture that somehow felt like acknowledgement, like permission, like the starting gun in a race I'd been training for since the day my parents told me I wasn't good enough to be their daughter. Daniel Foster rose from his seat, gathering his materials with practiced efficiency. As he moved toward the front of the courtroom, I saw my mother's hand reach out and clutch my father's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. For just a second her mask slipped, and I saw something raw underneath, fear maybe, or the first trembling recognition that this wasn't going to go the way they'd planned. My father's face remained impassive, but that eye twitch had become more pronounced, a steady rhythm that betrayed the anxiety he was working so hard to hide. Jessica leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she tried to assess the situation, to calculate the angles, to figure out how this would affect her. Even now, facing the possibility of exposure, she was thinking about herself, about her image, about how to spin this into something she could survive. The gallery shifted and murmured, reporters leaning forward, cameras adjusting position, everyone sensing that something significant was about to happen. This wasn't going to be a simple family dispute over money or property. The way Daniel carried himself, the thickness of that folder, the expression on Judge Hernandez's face, all of it suggested that what was coming would be bigger than anyone had anticipated. I could feel the anticipation building like pressure before a storm, that electric quality in the air that meant everything was about to change. I thought about my grandmother, Dr. Helen Warren, the only person in my family who'd ever made me feel like I mattered. She'd been a psychology professor at Pacific Northwest University, a woman who dedicated her life to studying human behavior and self-worth, and the ways families either build up or tear down the people they're supposed to love. She died 6 months before my graduation, and I'd always wondered if things might have been different if she'd lived. Would she have stopped my parents from disowning me? Would her presence have been enough to shame them into basic human decency? Or would they have done it anyway, just waited until she wasn't around to witness their cruelty? I'd never know the answer to those questions, but what I did know was that she'd left me something more valuable than money or status. She'd left me the truth, documented and preserved and hidden away until I was ready to use it. The late morning sun had shifted slightly, the light now streaming directly through the windows behind the judge's bench, illuminating dust particles that floated through the air like tiny witnesses to everything that was about to unfold. I could smell coffee from somewhere, probably from the break room down the hall, mixed with the scent of old paper and floor polish and the particular smell of anxious bodies packed into a small space. My hands were steady in my lap, my breathing even and controlled, my mind clear in a way it hadn't been in years. I'd spent so long preparing for this moment that now that it was here, I felt almost calm, like an athlete at the starting line of the race they'd trained their entire life to run. Judge Hernandez was reading through something on her bench, her finger tracing lines of text, her expression neutral but focused. Whatever she was reviewing seemed to require careful attention, and the room waited in respectful silence while she finished. I used the time to study my parents one more time, trying to see them clearly without the filter of childhood hurt or anger or longing. Patricia Mitchell looked older than I remembered, though she'd clearly spent a fortune trying to hide it. The work had been subtle but extensive, the kind of maintenance that required regular appointments and significant money, and a deep fear of losing the one thing she valued most, her appearance. Robert Mitchell looked tired beneath his authoritative exterior, the kind of tired that comes from carrying secrets for too long. And Jessica, beautiful Jessica, looked exactly like what she was, a carefully constructed facade with nothing substantial underneath. They'd built their entire lives on appearances, on maintaining an image that required constant effort, and the sacrifice of anything real or genuine. They'd thrown away their own daughter because she didn't fit the picture they wanted to present to the world. And in doing so, they'd set in motion a chain of events that had led us all to this courtroom, to this moment, to this reckoning that they'd never seen coming. Part of me, a small part one tried not to acknowledge, felt something like pity for them. They'd chosen appearances over love, image over substance, and now they were about to learn the real cost of that choice. But the larger part of me, the part that had survived 10 years alone, that had built a new life from nothing, that had spent countless hours gathering evidence and preparing for this day. That part felt nothing but a cold determination to see this through to the end. The spring of 2014 arrived in Portland with the kind of perfect weather that makes people forget how much rain they'd endured through the winter. Cherry blossoms lined the streets near Pacific Northwest University, their petals drifting across the walkways like pink snow, and the air smelled clean and full of possibility. Graduation day dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that felt like a promise, like the universe was saying that good things were coming if you just believed hard enough. I woke up that morning in my dorm room feeling lighter than I had in months, maybe years. 4 years of relentless work, of late nights in the architecture studio, of proving myself over and over again, were finally culminating in this single moment of recognition. Summa cum laude, the highest honors. And more than that, a job offer from Henderson & Associates, one of Portland's most respected architectural firms, waiting for me to accept it. My roommate Tina had already left for her own graduation ceremony in the business school, but she'd stuck a note on the bathroom mirror before she went. It said, "You did it, Becca. You're amazing and don't let anyone tell you different." She'd drawn a little heart at the bottom, and I'd felt my throat tighten when I read it, because Tina had been one of the few people in my life who'd made me feel like I was worth something just as I was. She'd never commented on my appearance except to compliment something I wore, or tell me my smile lit up a room. She'd never suggested I needed to change or fix or improve myself. She just accepted me as I was, and that kind of unconditional positive regard had been so foreign to me that it had taken me almost 2 years to trust it. I put on the dress I'd bought specifically for this day, navy blue with simple lines, nothing too flashy or attention-seeking. I'd learned early that drawing attention to myself and my family was dangerous, that it was better to fade into the background than risk being scrutinized and found wanting. My mother had trained me well in the art of invisibility, though she'd never understood that the lessons she'd taught me would eventually become armor rather than shame. I did my makeup carefully, not trying to transform myself but just trying to look polished and put together, the way someone should look when they're accepting a major academic honor. My hair, dark and thick and never quite willing to do what I wanted it to do, I pulled back into a simple bun at the base of my neck. Professional. Understated. Safe. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon at the university's main outdoor amphitheater. My parents had confirmed they would be there, along with Jessica, though their confirmation had come through my mother's assistant rather than directly. That should have been my first warning, but I was too caught up in the day's significance to pay attention to the small signals I'd learned to read so carefully growing up. I'd wanted so badly for them to be proud of me, for this achievement to finally be enough to earn their approval, that I'd ignored every instinct telling me to protect myself. I met up with my classmates from the architecture program outside the building where we were supposed to gather before processing into the ceremony. Everyone was buzzing with nervous energy, adjusting caps and gowns, taking photos, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't that funny because we were all running on adrenaline and relief, and the strange sadness that comes with endings, even when they're also beginnings. Marcus Thompson found me in the crowd, his grin wide and genuine, his graduation gown already rumpled despite the ceremony not having started yet. Marcus had been my friend since sophomore year, when we'd been paired together on a project designing a community center for an underserved neighborhood. He was studying urban planning with a focus on affordable housing, and we'd connected immediately over our shared belief that architecture and design should serve everyone, not just the wealthy. He pulled me into a hug that lifted me off my feet, spinning me around while I laughed and told him to put me down before he wrinkled my gown. He said we'd done it, we'd actually made it through, and wasn't it crazy that in a few months we'd be out in the real world actually getting paid to do what we loved. His joy was infectious, and for a few minutes I let myself just exist in that moment, surrounded by people who knew me and liked me and thought I was capable and valuable. It was a feeling I'd learned not to take for granted because I knew how rare it was, how easily it could slip away. The ceremony itself was a blur of names and faces and speeches about potential and futures, and making the world a better place. I sat with my program in the section reserved for honors graduates, watching the sea of people in the audience, trying to spot my family but unable to see clearly from where I was sitting. When they called my name, when I walked across that stage and accepted my diploma with highest honors, I heard applause that sounded like it came from very far away. The dean shook my hand and said something about being proud, about students like me representing the best of what the university stood for, But I was already scanning the audience again, still searching for my parents' faces, still hoping to see pride reflected back at me. After the ceremony, graduates flooded out onto the lawn where families were gathering, taking photos, celebrating with flowers and balloons and tears of joy. I made my way through the crowd, looking for my parents, my heart hammering with an anxiety I was trying to suppress. I found them near the edge of the lawn, standing slightly apart from the chaos, their posture suggesting they'd rather be anywhere else. My mother wore white, as she almost always did, a tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire semester's tuition. My father stood next to her in a dark suit, checking his watch in that way that meant he had somewhere more important to be. Jessica stood a little behind them, looking bored and beautiful in a pale pink dress, her phone in her hand, probably updating her social media with carefully curated photos of herself at her sister's graduation. I walked toward them with my diploma clutched in my hand, feeling suddenly self-conscious in a way I hadn't felt all day. My mother's eyes swept over me when I approached, and I watched her expression shift from neutral to something colder, something that made my stomach drop even before she said a word. My father barely glanced at me before returning his attention to his watch. Jessica looked up from her phone long enough to smirk, that familiar expression that had haunted my childhood, the one that said she was watching me fail at something she'd never even had to try at. I said hello, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended, hating myself for already shrinking in their presence. I told them thank you for coming, that it meant a lot to me that they were here. My mother's laugh was soft and cold, the kind of sound that could cut skin if you weren't careful. She said that of course they came, that they always fulfilled their obligations even when it was inconvenient. The word obligations hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Not pride, not love, not celebration. Obligation, duty, the burden of having a daughter who didn't meet their standards, but who they couldn't quite disown without causing a social scandal. My father finally looked at me fully, and I saw disappointment etched into every line of his face. He said that the ceremony was nice, that it was good I'd managed to graduate with honors given my disadvantages. The word disadvantages made me flinch, even though I'd heard it in variations of it my entire life. He'd always had a way of making his cruelty sound reasonable, almost kind, as if he was just stating facts rather than driving knives into vulnerable flesh. I asked him what he meant, even though I knew had always known. But some part of me needed to hear him say it out loud, needed to stop pretending that I didn't understand exactly what he thought of me. He glanced at my mother before answering, as if checking for permission or confirmation. She gave the smallest nod, and I realized in that moment that whatever was about to happen had been planned, that they discussed this beforehand, maybe even rehearsed it. My father said that they needed to talk to me privately, that this wasn't a conversation for a public setting. He gestured toward a quieter area near the parking lot, away from the celebrating families and the joy that suddenly felt like it belonged to everyone except me. We walked in silence, me trailing slightly behind like a child being led to punishment, them side by side presenting a united front. Jessica followed, still on her phone but clearly interested enough to witness whatever was about to unfold. We stopped near my father's car, a black Mercedes that was always perfectly clean, perfectly maintained, perfectly representative of a man who believed that what you drove said everything about your worth. The parking lot was less crowded here, most people still on the lawn taking photos and making plans for celebration dinners. The cherry blossoms were thick on the ground, crushed under tires and feet, their pink brightness already turning brown. My mother spoke first, her voice carrying that tone of patient explanation she used when she wanted to seem reasonable while saying something cruel. She said that they'd been discussing my future, that they had concerns about my ability to represent the family appropriately given my challenges. I asked what challenges, my voice sharper than I'd intended, some part of me finally pushing back against the careful euphemisms they'd used my entire life. She looked at me like I was being deliberately obtuse, like we both knew exactly what she meant, and my refusal to acknowledge it was just another example of my inadequacy. Jessica laughed, a sound bright and mean, and said that we all knew what they meant, that I could stop playing dumb. My mother shot her a look that said to be quiet, that this needed to be handled delicately, but the damage was done. The pretense of kindness, thin as it had been, evaporated completely. My father pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, white and crisp and official looking. He said that they decided it would be best for everyone if we made a clean break, that I was an adult now with my degree and my job prospects, and it was time for me to make my own way without relying on the family name. I stared at the envelope without taking it, not understanding yet what he was saying. I told him I'd never relied on the family name, that I'd worked for everything I'd achieved, that my grades and my honors and my job offer had nothing to do with being a Mitchell. My mother made a dismissive sound, waving her hand as if brushing away my words like annoying insects. She said that everything had to do with being a Mitchell, that the reason I'd even been admitted to Pacific Northwest University was because of their donations, that the reason Henderson and Associates had offered me a position was because Robert Mitchell's name carried weight in this city. The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with precision on insecurities I'd spent years trying to overcome. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to pull out my portfolio and my transcripts and prove that my work spoke for itself regardless of my last name. But something in their expressions stopped me, something that told me it wouldn't matter what I said or showed them. They'd already decided what they believed about me, and no amount of evidence would change their minds. My father pushed the envelope toward me, his patience clearly wearing thin. He said that inside was a check for $5,000, which he considered more than generous given that I'd been a drain on family resources for 22 years. He said that after today, they expected me to change my name, to stop associating myself with the Mitchell family, and to make my own way in the world without embarrassing them further. The words came out clinical and cold, like he was discussing a business transaction rather than disowning his daughter. I looked at my mother, searching for some sign of hesitation, some flicker of maternal instinct or regret. Instead, I saw relief in her eyes, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for years and was glad it was finally here. She said that I had to understand their position, that they tried to help me, tried to find solutions for my problems, but ultimately some things couldn't be fixed. She said that Jessica needed to be their focus now, that she had real potential, that they couldn't let my situation continue to overshadow her opportunities. Jessica stood behind them looking triumphant, finally getting what she'd wanted all along, the complete removal of any competition for our parents' attention and resources. I asked them what exactly my situation was, what problem they thought I had that was so terrible it warranted disowning me on my graduation day. My mother sighed like I was forcing her to state something obvious and unkind. She said that I knew very well what the problem was, that I'd always known, that my appearance had been a source of concern and embarrassment since childhood. She said that they'd hoped I would improve as I got older, that maybe adolescence would bring positive changes, but that clearly their hopes had been misplaced. She said that in their social circles, in the world they operated in, image mattered tremendously, and I simply didn't fit the image they needed to project. My father added that it wasn't personal, that they were sure I had many fine qualities, but that those qualities didn't change the fundamental reality that I wasn't suited to be part of their public life. He said that by releasing me from the family now, they were actually doing me a favor, allowing me to build a life where I wouldn't constantly be compared to standards I couldn't meet. He said it kindly, almost gently, as if he genuinely believed he was being compassionate rather than devastating. I took the envelope because I didn't know what else to do, my hands moving automatically, while my brain tried to process what was happening. This was real. They were actually doing this. On my graduation day, surrounded by the remnants of celebration, my parents were calmly explaining that I wasn't good enough to be their daughter anymore. The envelope felt heavy in my hand, heavier than paper and ink should feel, weighted with all the years of hoping I could be enough for them. Jessica moved closer, unable to resist getting in one final cruelty. She said that maybe now I'd finally understand that some people were meant to be in the spotlight and others weren't, that it wasn't my fault I was born plain, but it also wasn't their responsibility to pretend otherwise. She said that she'd always felt sorry for me, having to watch her succeed at everything while I struggled just to be acceptable. Her voice dripped with false sympathy, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. My mother checked her watch, expensive and delicate on her thin wrist, and said that they needed to go, that they had dinner reservations and this had already taken longer than expected. She told me to take care of myself, to build whatever life I could, and to please respect their wishes about not using the family name. My father was already walking toward the car, done with this conversation, ready to move on to whatever came next on his agenda. Jessica lingered just long enough to take one last look at me, her eyes scanning my face with satisfaction, as if confirming that yes, She really was the pretty one, the valuable one, the daughter worth keeping. They drove away, leaving me standing alone in the parking lot with an envelope full of money and a diploma that suddenly felt meaningless. Around me, other families were still celebrating, still taking photos and making plans and talking about how proud they were. The cherry blossoms continued to fall, petals catching in my hair and on my graduation gown. Nature's celebration continuing oblivious to the fact that my world had just ended. I walked back toward campus, not knowing where else to go. The envelope clutched in my hand like evidence of a crime I couldn't quite name. I spent that night in my dorm room, which I technically wasn't supposed to be in anymore since graduation had happened and move out was supposed to be complete within 48 hours. But the resident advisor was someone I'd tutored in statistics the year before, and when she saw me stumbling through the hallway with mascara streaked down my face and my graduation gown dragging behind me, she'd quietly slipped me a key and told me I could stay through the weekend. I sat on my bare mattress, the room already half emptied. Tina's side completely cleared out except for a few dust bunnies and the outline on the wall where her poster had hung. The envelope sat on my desk, unopened, glowing white in the darkness like something radioactive. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in the parking lot, examining every word like picking at a wound. The clinical way my father had explained their decision, as if he was laying off an employee rather than abandoning his child. The relief in my mother's eyes when she realized I wasn't going to fight back, wasn't going to make a scene. Jessica's triumphant smirk, finally getting everything she'd ever wanted without having to share it with anyone. But more than the specific cruelties, it was the years of context behind them that kept me awake that night. The lifetime of small moments that had all been leading to this inevitable conclusion. I remember being 7 years old, standing in a department store dressing room while my mother held up dress after dress, sighing with each one because none of them made me look the way she wanted. She'd finally settled on something with a high collar and long sleeves, telling the saleswoman that some girls could wear anything while others needed more coverage. The saleswoman had looked uncomfortable, but she'd nodded and wrapped the dress in tissue paper like that assessment was perfectly normal. I'd worn that dress to a family wedding, and every time someone complimented Jessica on how beautiful she looked in her pink ruffled creation, my mother had smiled and agreed while I stood invisible beside them. I remember being 12, overhearing my father on the phone with someone discussing potential boarding schools. He'd said that they had a situation that needed addressing, that their younger daughter was perfect, but the older one presented challenges that required professional management. He'd used the word challenges like it was a diagnosis, something requiring intervention and treatment. When I'd asked him later who he'd been talking about, he'd told me it was business and not my concern, but his eyes had slid away from mine in a way that confirmed I'd heard exactly what I thought I'd heard. I remember being 16, getting asked to junior prom by a boy named Tyler who was smart and kind and genuinely seemed to like me. I'd been excited, nervous, happy in a way I hadn't been in a long time. My mother had taken me dress shopping, and I thought maybe this was a turning point, maybe she was finally going to treat me like she treated Jessica when boys showed interest in her. Instead, she'd steered me toward the back of the store where the more conservative options were displayed, holding up dresses that looked like something a grandmother would wear. When I'd protested, wanting something more age-appropriate, more current, she'd said firmly that some girls could pull off trendy looks and others needed to be more careful about drawing attention to themselves. The prom itself had been fine, better than fine actually. Tyler had been a gentleman, complimenting my dress even though I knew it was dowdy, dancing with me even though I was self-conscious about every movement. We'd had fun, real fun, the kind where you forget to be worried about how you look because you're too busy enjoying yourself. But when I'd gotten home that night, still floating on the happiness of being treated like a normal teenage girl for once, I'd found my mother waiting up in the living room. She'd asked me if anything had happened with Tyler, her voice sharp with concern. When I'd said no, that we'd just danced and talked and had a nice time, she'd looked relieved. Then she'd said that it was probably for the best if I didn't encourage him, that she'd hate for me to develop expectations that couldn't be met. I'd been too young then to fully understand what she meant, but I'd felt the message underneath the words. Don't get your hopes up. Don't think someone might actually want you. Don't embarrass yourself by believing you're worthy of romance or desire or love. The message had sunk in deeper than I'd realized at the time, shaping the way I moved through the world, the way I interacted with people, the way I thought about my own value. By the time I got to college, I'd learned to make myself small and unobtrusive, to focus on achievement rather than connection, to pour all my energy into being exceptional at something that had nothing to do with physical appearance. Architecture had saved me in a way. In the studio, what mattered was your vision, your technical skill, your ability to solve complex spatial problems and create beauty out of function. Nobody cared what you looked like when you were bent over a drafting table at 3 in the morning trying to get the proportions right on a facade. The work spoke for itself, and I discovered I was good at it, better than good. My professors had praised my designs, my attention to detail, my ability to think about how buildings would actually be used by real people rather than just how they'd look in a magazine spread. For 4 years, I'd lived in a world where my value was determined by my abilities rather than my face, and I'd flourished in that environment. But my parents' assessment in the parking lot had stripped all of that away in minutes, reducing everything I'd accomplished to nothing more than their influence and name. They'd made it clear that in their eyes, my achievements were meaningless because I was fundamentally flawed in a way that no amount of success could fix. The check in the envelope was their final statement on my worth, $5,000 to compensate them for the inconvenience of having raised me, a severance package for a daughter they'd never wanted in the first place. As dawn broke on the morning after graduation, I finally opened the envelope. The check was exactly as my father had said, $5,000 made out to Rebecca and Mitchell in his precise, controlled handwriting. There was nothing else in the envelope, no note, no explanation beyond what they'd already said, no acknowledgement that this was anything other than a straightforward transaction. I held that check up to the early light coming through my dorm window, watching my father's signature loop across the bottom, and I felt something inside me that had been bent and compressed for 22 years finally snap. I'd spent my entire life trying to be enough for them, trying to compensate for whatever deficiency they saw in me, trying to prove that I had value despite not meeting their standards for appearance. I'd worked myself to exhaustion, achieved every academic honor available, secured a prestigious job, done everything right according to every measure except the one they cared about. And it hadn't mattered at all. Nothing I could do would ever matter because they decided before I was old enough to understand what was happening that I wasn't worthy of their love or acceptance or basic human decency. The anger that rose in me that morning wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold and clear and focused, like ice forming over deep water. They'd thrown me away, but in doing so they'd also released me. I didn't have to try to please them anymore. I didn't have to shrink myself to fit their expectations or apologize for existing in a way they found inconvenient. I could take their money, their dismissal, their final rejection, and I could use it to build something they'd never see coming. I could disappear like they wanted, but not in the way they imagined. I could become someone new, someone stronger, someone who understood exactly what they were, and what they'd done. I took that check to the bank as soon as it opened on Monday morning. The teller processed it without comment, probably used to seeing large deposits from college students dealing with graduation gifts and loan disbursements. $5,000 appeared in my account, money from parents who'd made it clear it was the last I'd ever receive from them. I withdrew $2,000 in cash, put the rest in savings, and started making plans. The job offer from Henderson & Associates was real. I'd confirmed that with the hiring manager directly, but taking it would mean staying in Portland, working in a city where the Mitchell name carried weight, where I'd inevitably run into my parents at professional functions or society events, where I'd always be Rebecca Mitchell who wasn't quite good enough. The hiring manager had seemed genuinely impressed with my portfolio during the interview process, had talked about my innovative approach to sustainable design, and my clear understanding of how architecture could serve community needs. But I couldn't stop hearing my mother's voice saying that the only reason they'd offered me the position was because of my last name. I called the hiring manager and declined the position, citing personal circumstances that required me to relocate. She'd sounded disappointed, said that their loss was someone else's gain, and told me to stay in touch if I ever wanted to return to the Portland market. I thanked her and hung up, feeling like I was burning a bridge I might later regret losing, but also feeling like I needed to start completely fresh somewhere my parents' influence couldn't reach. Marcus found me packing up my room 2 days later, tossing clothes into a duffel bag with no particular system or care. He stood in the doorway watching me for a minute before asking what I was doing, where I was going, what had happened. I told him I was leaving Portland, that I needed a change, that the Henderson job wasn't the right fit after all. He'd looked at me with those sharp eyes that had always been able to see through whatever facade I was presenting, And he'd said quietly that this had something to do with my family, didn't it? It wasn't a question. I'd broken down then, the first time I'd really cried since the parking lot, telling him everything my parents had said. The way they'd disowned me, the check, the expectation that I'd disappear and never embarrass them again. Marcus had listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with anger on my behalf, his hands clenching into fists like he wanted to hit something. When I finished, he'd pulled me into a hug and said that my parents were shallow, cruel people who didn't deserve me, that I was brilliant and talented and worth 10 of them, and that if I really wanted to leave Portland he'd help me however he could. We spent the afternoon researching cities where I might be able to start over. Places far enough from Portland that the Mitchell name meant nothing. Places with strong architectural markets and progressive design cultures. Seattle was too close, San Francisco too expensive, Los Angeles too sprawling and image-focused. Marcus suggested Austin, Texas, a city known for its creativity and independence, a place where being different was celebrated rather than condemned. I looked up architectural firms in Austin, housing costs, weather patterns, trying to imagine myself in a place I'd never been, rebuilding a life from scratch. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. I'd never lived anywhere but Portland, had barely traveled beyond the Pacific Northwest. Everything I knew about architecture was filtered through the lens of this region, its climate and materials and aesthetic preferences. But maybe that was exactly what I needed, to be somewhere completely different, somewhere I could reinvent myself without the weight of 22 years of conditioning and criticism dragging me down. I used some of the cash from my parents' check to buy a bus ticket to Austin one way, departing in 3 days. The rest I kept for initial expenses once I arrived, knowing I'd need to find a place to live and a job quickly before my meager savings ran out. Marcus helped me pack the few belongings I wanted to keep, mostly books and drafting supplies and a laptop that had barely survived 4 years of constant use. Everything else, furniture and kitchen supplies and clothes that felt like they belonged to someone I used to be, I donated or left behind. On my last night in Portland, Marcus took me to dinner at a small restaurant near campus, the kind of place where graduate students and professors gathered to argue about theory and politics over cheap wine and pasta. We didn't talk about my parents or the future or any of the heavy things that were weighing on both of us. Instead, we talked about our favorite projects from the past 4 years, the professors who'd inspired us, the all-nighters in the studio that had somehow been fun despite the stress and exhaustion. We talked about the community center we designed together sophomore year, how we'd both cared so much about making it functional and welcoming for the neighborhood it was meant to serve. Near the end of the meal, Marcus had pulled out a small notebook and torn out a page covered in his messy handwriting. He said it was a list of contacts he had in Austin, friends from a summer internship he'd done there after junior year, people who might be able to help me get established. He said that one of them, a woman named Angela Rodriguez who ran a small firm focused on affordable housing, was always looking for talented designers who cared about social impact. He made me promise to call her as soon as I got to Austin, to use his name to let his network become my network. I'd taken that page and folded it carefully into my wallet, next to my bus ticket and the driver's license that still bore the name Rebecca Mitchell. I told Marcus that I didn't know how to thank him, that he'd been a better friend to me than I probably deserved. He'd shaken his head and said that friendship wasn't about deserving, that I'd been there for him plenty of times over the past few years, that this was what people did for each other when they actually cared. The simplicity of that statement, the idea that caring for someone didn't require them to earn it or prove their worth, had made my throat tight with emotion I couldn't quite express. We'd walked back to campus through streets lined with blooming trees, the spring air warm and sweet, the city beautiful in the way Portland always was at this time of year. I tried to memorize it, knowing I might not be back for a long time if ever. This was the city where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to make myself small and quiet and acceptable, where I'd also discovered I was capable of more than I'd been told to expect. Leaving felt like failure and freedom mixed together, like running away and running toward something at the same time. The bus left early on a Thursday morning, before the city was fully awake. I'd said goodbye to Marcus the night before, both of us pretending it wasn't as significant as it felt, both of us promising to stay in touch even though we knew how these things usually went. I boarded with my duffel bag and backpack, finding a window seat near the back where I could watch Portland disappear behind me as we headed south. The bus was mostly empty, a few other passengers scattered throughout, everyone wrapped in their own thoughts or sleeping against the windows. As we crossed the bridge over the Willamette River, I looked back one last time at the downtown skyline, at the buildings I'd studied in my architecture classes, at the city that held every memory of my childhood and adolescence. Somewhere in the wealthy suburb of Lake Oswego, my parents were probably just waking up, having coffee in their perfect kitchen, discussing their day's plans without any thought of the daughter they'd discarded. Jessica was probably still asleep, her phone on her nightstand full of photos from someone's graduation party, her life continuing exactly as it always had, unmarred by conscience or consequence. I turned away from the window and pulled out the page Marcus had given me, reading through the names and phone numbers of people I'd never met, but who represented possibility and second chances. Angela Rodriguez's name was at the top of the list, underlined twice, with a note in Marcus's handwriting that said, "Call her first. She's good people and she'll help you." I didn't know anything about Angela Rodriguez beyond what Marcus had said. Didn't know if she'd actually have work for me, or if Marcus's recommendation would carry any weight with her. But I had to believe that somewhere ahead of me, in a city I'd never seen, there was a chance to become someone other than the disappointing daughter of disappointed parents. The bus rolled south through Oregon, then into California, the landscape changing from the lush green of the Pacific Northwest to the golden brown of the Central Valley. I slept in fits and starts, my body uncomfortable in the cramped seat, my mind too active to fully rest. Other passengers got on and off at various stops, a rotating cast of travelers with their own stories and destinations. I wondered what they saw when they looked at me, if they could tell I was running away from something, if my face showed any sign of the upheaval of the past few days. Somewhere in Nevada, as the sun set over the desert in shades of orange and purple I'd never seen in cloud-covered Portland, I realized I was crying. Not sobbing, just silent tears running down my face while I stared out at the vast empty landscape. I was crying for the little girl who'd stood in that department store dressing room trying on clothes that were meant to hide her. I was crying for the teenager who'd been told not to encourage a kind boy's interests because she might develop unrealistic expectations. I was crying for the college graduate who'd earned every honor available only to be told her achievements meant nothing. I was crying for all the versions of myself I tried to be in an effort to earn love that was never going to be offered freely. But I was also crying because I was free. Whatever happened next, however hard the road ahead might be, I would never again have to endure my mother's dismissive sighs or my father's disappointed stares or Jessica's cruel comparisons. I would never again have to shrink myself to fit their narrow definition of acceptable. I could fail or succeed on my own terms, build a life that reflected my values rather than their expectations, become whoever I wanted to be without constantly measuring myself against standards designed to ensure I'd always fall short. The price of that freedom was everything I'd ever known, everyone I'd grown up with, the only family I had. But as the bus carried me further from Portland and closer to Austin, I started to believe that maybe the price was worth paying. I arrived in Austin on a Saturday afternoon in late May when the temperature was pushing 95 degrees, and the humidity made the air feel thick enough to swim through. The bus station was smaller than I'd expected, tucked into a part of downtown that felt gritty and real in a way that contrasted sharply with the gleaming tech campuses I'd read about online. I stepped off the bus with my duffel bag and backpack, immediately feeling sweat prick along my hairline, and stood on the sidewalk trying to orient myself in a city where I knew absolutely no one and had no plan beyond the list of names in my wallet. The first order of business was finding somewhere to stay. I'd researched hostels and cheap extended stay motels before leaving Portland, knowing my budget was tight and I needed to make every dollar stretch as far as possible. There was a place called the Wanderer's Rest about 2 miles from the bus station that advertised weekly rates and didn't require a credit check or references. I caught a local bus headed in that direction, watching the city roll past the windows, trying to get a sense of the place that would be my home for the foreseeable future. Austin felt different from Portland in ways I couldn't quite articulate yet, something about the light or the architecture or the energy of the people on the streets. It felt younger somehow, more chaotic, less concerned with maintaining a particular image. The Wanderer's Rest turned out to be exactly what I'd expected. A converted motel with peeling paint and a manager who barely looked up from his computer when I asked about availability. He quoted me a rate for a week, cash only, and handed me a key attached to a plastic tag with the room number written in faded marker. The room was small and smelled faintly of cigarettes and industrial cleaner, but it had a bed and a tiny bathroom and a window air conditioning unit that rattled but worked. I dropped my bags on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the reality of my situation settle over me like a weight. I was alone in a strange city with less than $3,000 to my name, no job, no connections beyond a list of phone numbers from a friend's summer internship 3 years ago. The loneliness hit me hard that first night. I'd been so focused on getting away from Portland, on escaping my parents and their rejection, that I hadn't fully processed what it would feel like to be completely untethered from everything familiar. I ate dinner from a convenience store down the street, sitting on my bed watching local news on a television that only got a few channels. The weekend weather forecast promised more heat, more humidity, storms rolling in from the Gulf. The sports anchor talked about the Longhorns with an enthusiasm that suggested football was practically a religion here. Everything felt foreign and overwhelming, and I found myself wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake, if I should have just stayed in Portland and dealt with the discomfort of occasionally running into my family rather than trying to start over in a place where I had no foundation. But Sunday morning I woke up with clearer resolve. I couldn't afford to wallow or second-guess myself. I had maybe 3 weeks before my money ran out completely, which meant I needed to find work immediately. I pulled out the list Marcus had given me and studied the names again. Angela Rodriguez was still at the top, still underlined twice, still marked as the person to call first. I dialed her number from the pay phone in the motel office, my hands sweating from nerves rather than heat, rehearsing what I'd say if she actually answered. She picked up on the third ring, her voice warm with a slight Texas drawl I hadn't expected. I stumbled through my introduction, saying I was a recent graduate from Pacific Northwest University, that Marcus Thompson had given me her name, that I just moved to Austin and was looking for opportunities in sustainable and community-focused architecture. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I held my breath thinking she was about to politely brush me off. Instead, she said that any friend of Marcus's deserved at least a conversation, and asked if I could come by her office Monday morning at 9. I spent the rest of Sunday preparing for that meeting like my life depended on it because in many ways it did. I reviewed my portfolio, selecting the projects I thought would resonate with someone focused on affordable housing and social impact. The community center Marcus and I had designed together, a low-income housing renovation I'd proposed for a neighborhood in Northeast Portland, a public library concept that prioritized accessibility and community gathering spaces over architectural showiness. I printed fresh copies of my resume at a print shop downtown, using the last of my quarters to make sure they came out crisp and professional. I picked out the most interview-appropriate outfit I owned, a simple gray dress that had survived the bus trip without too many wrinkles, and shoes that were professional without being pretentious. Monday morning I arrived at Angela Rodriguez's office 15 minutes early, finding it in a converted warehouse in East Austin that housed several small creative businesses. The neighborhood was transitioning, old industrial buildings being renovated into studios and offices, taco trucks on every corner, murals covering walls that had probably been blank concrete a few years earlier. Angela's office was on the second floor, a large open space with drafting tables and computer stations and walls covered in sketches and photographs of completed projects. A young man with purple hair and multiple piercings looked up from his computer when I walked in, asking if he could help me. I told him I had an appointment with Angela, and he gestured toward a glass-walled office in the corner where a woman in her 40s sat surrounded by rolled blueprints and empty coffee cups. She looked up when the purple-haired assistant knocked on her door frame, her face breaking into a smile that seemed genuine rather than performative. She waved me in, clearing a stack of papers off the chair across from her desk, and stuck out her hand for me to shake. Her grip was firm, her eyes direct and appraising but not unkind. We talked for over an hour. She asked about my education, my design philosophy, what had brought me to Austin, what I was hoping to accomplish in my career. I was honest with her in a way I hadn't planned to be, telling her that I'd left Portland because I needed a fresh start, that I was interested in architecture that served real people rather than just wealthy clients, that I believed good design should be accessible to everyone regardless of income. I showed her my portfolio, watching her face as she studied each project, the way her finger traced the lines of my drawings, the questions she asked about material choices and cost considerations, and how I'd thought about the actual humans who would use these spaces. When she finally closed my portfolio and looked at me across her cluttered desk, I braced myself for rejection disguised as encouragement, the kind of speech I'd heard from professors sometimes about how talented I was but how competitive the field was. Instead, Angela said that she didn't have a full-time position available immediately, but she could offer me contract work starting that week, helping with construction documentation on an affordable housing project in South Austin. The pay wouldn't be great, she warned, but it would be steady for at least 3 months, and if things worked out there might be opportunities for something more permanent down the line. I accepted before she'd even finished explaining the details, relief flooding through me so intensely I felt dizzy. She smiled and said she'd thought I would. That Marcus had sent her an email over the weekend saying I was someone worth taking a chance on, that he'd never steered her wrong before. I felt a rush of gratitude toward Marcus for reaching out without telling me, for using his connections on my behalf, for believing in me enough to put his own reputation on the line. Angela told me to come back Wednesday morning ready to work, that I should bring whatever supplies I had and a willingness to learn how they did things in Texas, which she promised was different from how they did things in the Pacific Northwest. Walking out of that office into the Austin heat, I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time since graduation. It wasn't the job at Henderson and Associates that I'd turned down, wasn't the prestigious position at a well-known firm that would have looked impressive on a resume, but it was real work with someone who cared about the same things I cared about, in a city where nobody knew or cared about the Mitchell family name. It was a beginning, which was all I needed. The next few months passed in a blur of work and adjustment and slowly building a life from nothing. The contract work with Angela turned into more contract work, then into a part-time position, then finally into a full-time role with benefits and a salary that allowed me to move out of the Wanderer's Rest into a small apartment in a neighborhood called Hyde Park. The apartment was nothing special, a studio in a complex full of graduate students and young professionals, but it was mine, paid for with money I'd earned through work I was proud of. I furnished it slowly from thrift stores and estate sales, choosing pieces because I liked them rather than because they projected the right image. Austin itself became less foreign as I learned its rhythms and peculiarities. The oppressive summer heat that had seemed unbearable in May became something I adapted to, learning to plan outdoor activities for early morning or evening, discovering that everyone just accepted that you'd be sweaty from June through September. I found coffee shops I liked, running trails along the river, breakfast taco places that became regular stops. I made friends slowly, mostly through work, people who knew me only as Becca the architect who did good work and had strong opinions about building codes and accessibility standards. I'd legally changed my name 6 months after arriving in Austin, a process that felt both momentous and anticlimactic. Rebecca and Mitchell became Rebecca and Warren, taking my grandmother's maiden name as a way to honor the one person in my family who'd ever made me feel valued. The clerk who processed the paperwork was bored and efficient, probably handling a dozen name changes that week for various reasons. To her it was routine paperwork. To me it was erasing the last official tie to people who'd made it clear they didn't want to claim me anyway. I got a new driver's license, updated my social security card, changed my name on my bank accounts and email addresses. Becca Warren felt like a different person from Rebecca Mitchell, and in many ways she was. The physical changes came gradually, not because I thought there was anything wrong with how I looked but because I wanted to feel different, to see someone new when I looked in the mirror. I started running regularly, partly for stress relief and partly because I'd never been athletic and wanted to prove to myself that I could be. I found a hairstylist who taught me how to work with my thick hair rather than fighting it, cutting it into a style that felt modern and intentional. I learned about skincare from a coworker who was passionate about it, not in a way that suggested I needed fixing but in a way that felt like self-care rather than self-improvement. I experimented with clothes that I actually liked rather than clothes designed to help me disappear, discovering I had opinions about fashion I'd never been allowed to explore. But the biggest change was internal, a slow shift in how I thought about myself and my worth. Working with Angela and her team, I was surrounded by people who valued creativity and problem-solving and social consciousness. My ideas were taken seriously, my designs were implemented, my contributions were recognized and appreciated. Nobody commented on my appearance except occasionally to compliment something I was wearing or to note that I looked happy or healthy. My value at the firm was determined entirely by the quality of my work and my ability to collaborate effectively with the team. It was the environment I'd had briefly in college, but now it was my everyday reality, and living in that reality day after day slowly rewired something fundamental in how I saw myself. I avoided contact with anyone from my old life in Portland. I didn't call my parents or Jessica, and they certainly didn't reach out to me. Marcus and I exchanged emails occasionally, brief updates on our respective lives, but even that communication became less frequent over time as we both got busy with work and new relationships and the general forward momentum of building adult lives. Social media made it easy to keep loose tabs on people without actually engaging with them, and I sometimes found myself looking at Jessica's Instagram, watching her post carefully curated photos of her seemingly perfect life. She'd gotten engaged to someone from a prominent Portland family, exactly the kind of match my parents would have orchestrated if they could have. My mother appeared occasionally in the background of photos, still beautiful, still perfectly put together, still projecting an image of gracious elegance that I knew was carefully maintained artifice. I felt nothing looking at those photos, no jealousy or longing or even anger anymore. They were strangers living a life I once been part of but no longer had any connection to. Sometimes I thought about reaching out, about sending an email to my parents updating them on my life, proving that I'd not only survived but thrived after they'd thrown me away. But I never did because I realized their approval or acknowledgement didn't matter to me anymore. The girl who desperately wanted her parents to be proud of her had been left behind in a parking lot in Portland, and the woman I'd become didn't need their validation to know her own worth. 3 years after moving to Austin, I got a call from a lawyer in Portland whose name I didn't recognize. He said he was handling the estate of Dr. Helen Warren, my grandmother, and that there were some items she'd left specifically for me. I'd known my grandmother had passed away, had seen the obituary online and felt the grief of losing the one person in my family who'd ever truly seen me. But I'd assumed whatever small inheritance she might have left me would have been redirected to Jessica or donated to charity, that my parents would have made sure I got nothing. The lawyer said that wasn't the case, that my grandmother had been very specific in her will about my inheritance, and that he had documents that needed to be delivered to me in person or via secure courier. I arranged for the documents to be couriered to me in Austin, signing for a thick package that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Inside was a letter in my grandmother's handwriting, written months before her death when she'd apparently known she was dying. The letter explained that she'd always seen how my parents treated me, that she'd tried to intervene but had been told to mind her own business, that she'd felt guilty for not doing more to protect me from their cruelty. She wrote that she'd left me her house in Salem, Oregon, which she owned outright, along with the contents of her personal safe which she'd never told my parents existed. She said that inside that safe I would find things she'd been collecting for years, documentation of my parents' business dealings, evidence of things they'd done that weren't quite legal, insurance policies in case I ever needed leverage against them. The letter ended with an apology and a blessing. She wrote that she was sorry she hadn't been braver when she was alive, that she should have stood up to my parents more forcefully, that she regretted not being the advocate I'd needed. But she said she hoped that what she was leaving me now would give me the power to seek justice if I ever chose to, or at the very least the security of knowing I had options. She wrote that I'd always been her favorite grandchild, the one with the biggest heart and the most integrity, and that she was proud of who I was becoming even if my parents were too blind to see it. She signed it with love and hope, and reading it alone in my Austin apartment I cried harder than I had since the day I left Portland. The house in Salem turned out to be worth considerably more than I'd expected, the real estate market in Oregon having appreciated significantly in the years since my grandmother had bought it. But more valuable than the property itself was what I found in the safe, hidden in the back of her bedroom closet with the combination written on a piece of paper tucked into a book of poetry on her nightstand. Inside were file folders full of bank statements showing suspicious transfers, emails printed out and organized by date showing communications about tax evasion schemes, photographs of documents that appeared to have been altered, and a flash drive labeled simply with my initials and the date of my graduation. I took everything back to Austin and spent weeks going through it methodically, beginning to understand the scope of what my grandmother had uncovered. My father's real estate development business, the company that had been the foundation of the Mitchell family fortune, was built at least partially on fraud. There were inflated appraisals, kickbacks to city officials, workers cheated out of proper wages, environmental regulations ignored, affordable housing requirements dodged through shell companies and falsified records. The documentation was meticulous and damning, the kind of evidence that could destroy reputations and potentially lead to criminal charges. The flash drive was somehow even worse. It contained audio recordings, apparently made by my grandmother using a device hidden in her purse during family dinners and gatherings. There were conversations between my parents discussing how to hide income from the IRS, debates about whether to fire a worker who'd been injured on a job site before his workers' compensation claim could be processed, callous discussions about forcing out low-income residents from buildings they wanted to redevelop into luxury condos. And there were conversations about me, dozens of them over the years, my parents discussing what to do about their disappointing older daughter, my mother suggesting increasingly extreme solutions from boarding school to emancipation to waiting until I turned 18 and simply cutting me off. The recording from my graduation was there too, apparently made by my grandmother who'd planned to attend the ceremony but had been too ill that morning to leave her house. She'd called my mother to explain why she wouldn't be there, and my mother had casually mentioned that it didn't matter because they were planning to handle the situation with me that day anyway. My grandmother had asked what situation, and my mother had explained their plan to disown me, to pay me off and expect me to disappear. My grandmother's voice on the recording went cold and hard, telling my mother that what she was planning was cruel and unconscionable, that I was a remarkable young woman who deserved better from my family. My mother had laughed and said that my grandmother had always been too sentimental, that some decisions required practical thinking rather than emotion, that they were doing me a favor by cutting me loose before I could embarrass them further. Listening to that recording in my Austin apartment 5 years after the conversation had taken place, I finally understood that my grandmother had been collecting this evidence specifically for me, creating a weapon I could use if I ever decided I wanted justice or revenge or simply accountability. She'd known she was dying, had known she wouldn't be around to protect me, and had done the only thing she could think of to give me power over the people who'd hurt me. The gift was extraordinary and terrible, the kind of legacy that came with immense responsibility. I sat with that evidence for months trying to decide what to do with it. The easiest thing would have been to destroy it all, to let my parents continue their lives uninterrupted while I continued building mine in Austin. We were living completely separate existences at this point, neither affecting the other, and I'd finally reached a place of peace about my past. Did I really want to drag myself back into their orbit, to spend months or years pursuing legal action, to subject myself to the stress and publicity that would inevitably come with exposing their fraud? Part of me wanted to just let it go, to consider my successful life in Austin revenge enough, to prove my worth through achievement rather than through tearing them down. But another part of me couldn't ignore what I'd found. This wasn't just about my personal grievances with my parents. The evidence showed they cheated workers, displaced families, corrupted public officials, evaded taxes that should have funded public services. Their fraud had real victims beyond me, people who'd lost jobs or homes or opportunities because of the Mitchell family's greed and dishonesty. If I stayed silent, if I let them continue operating the way they'd been operating for years, I was complicit in whatever harm they caused going forward. My grandmother had trusted me with this information, had believed I would do the right thing with it even if that thing was difficult or painful. I started researching attorneys who specialized in financial fraud and whistleblower cases, looking for someone with experience taking on wealthy defendants who would fight hard to protect their reputations. I found a firm in Seattle, far enough from Portland to not be part of the same social circles, but close enough to understand the regional business landscape. The senior partner, a woman named Victoria Chun, agreed to review my evidence and assess whether I had a viable case. I sent her copies of everything, then waited through 2 agonizing weeks while she and her team examined what I'd provided. When Victoria finally called me back, her voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the excitement underneath. She said that what I'd given her was remarkable, that she'd rarely seen such comprehensive documentation of ongoing fraud, that with this evidence we could build a case that would be very difficult for my parents to defend against. She explained that there were multiple avenues we could pursue: civil suits to recover damages on behalf of defrauded parties, potential criminal referrals to state and federal prosecutors, complaints to professional licensing boards that could result in my father losing his ability to operate in real estate development. She said it would be a long process, probably years before everything was resolved, and that it would be extremely stressful for me personally as my parents would certainly retaliate however they could. I told her I needed time to think about it, to consider whether I was ready for what pursuing this would mean for my life. She said she understood that this kind of decision shouldn't be made quickly or lightly, but that she hoped I'd move forward because cases like this didn't come along often, and the potential for real accountability and justice was significant. We ended the call with an agreement that I'd get back to her within a month with my decision. I spent that month in a state of near constant anxiety, going through every possible scenario in my mind, trying to predict how this would play out and whether I could handle the consequences. I talked to Angela about it in vague terms, not revealing the specifics but asking for advice about taking on a fight against powerful people who'd hurt me in the past. She said that in her experience, you regretted the stands you didn't take more than the ones you did, that living with the knowledge that you'd let injustice slide because it was easier was corrosive to your sense of self over time. I talked to a therapist I'd started seeing a year earlier, working through my complicated feelings about family and revenge and justice. She helped me understand that what I was considering wasn't really revenge, that revenge was about hurting someone because they'd hurt you, while justice was about accountability and protecting future victims. In the end, what decided me was thinking about all the other daughters like me who'd grown up being told they weren't good enough, who'd internalized that message, who'd spent their lives trying to be smaller and quieter and more acceptable. If my parents could disown their own child over something as superficial as appearance, what did that say about their values and priorities? And if those same values and priorities guided their business decisions, how many people had been hurt by their willingness to prioritize profit and image over ethics and human decency? I had the power to hold them accountable, to say publicly that what they'd done was wrong, to potentially prevent them from hurting others in the future. How could I live with myself if I had that power and chose not to use it? I called Victoria Chun and told her I wanted to move forward with whatever legal action she thought was appropriate. She said she'd start drafting complaints and organizing the evidence into formats that would be most effective for different venues. She warned me again that this would be difficult, that my parents would hire the best attorneys money could buy, that they'd try to paint me as vindictive and unstable, that every aspect of my life would be scrutinized and potentially used against me. I told her I understood, that I'd spent 27 years being scrutinized and found wanting by my parents, and I was done letting their judgment define me. The first lawsuit was filed 6 weeks later, a civil action on behalf of a group of workers who'd been cheated out of proper wages and benefits by Mitchell and Associates. The evidence my grandmother had collected made the case straightforward enough that Victoria was confident we'd win, but she said that wasn't really the point. The point was to start a public process that would expose the pattern of fraud, that would encourage other victims to come forward, that would begin to unravel the carefully constructed image my parents had built over decades. The lawsuit made regional news immediately, the Mitchell name prominent enough in Portland that any suggestion of wrongdoing was newsworthy. My name appeared in the articles as the whistleblower who'd provided the evidence, Rebecca Warren, formerly Rebecca Mitchell, estranged daughter of the defendants. My phone started ringing constantly, reporters wanting interviews, old acquaintances from Portland reaching out with curiosity disguised as concern, even a few messages from people claiming to be victims of my parents' business practices asking if they could be included in the legal action. I gave one carefully worded interview to a journalist I'd researched and decided to trust, explaining that this wasn't about family drama but about accountability for business fraud, that the evidence spoke for itself, that I hoped justice would be served regardless of the defendant's wealth or social standing. The article that ran from that interview was fair and thorough, laying out the allegations without sensationalism, noting my credentials and career separate from my family, treating me as a credible witness rather than a vindictive daughter. My parents' response was exactly what I'd expected. Their attorney released a statement painting me as a troubled individual with a history of mental instability, suggesting I'd fabricated evidence out of anger over a routine family disagreement years earlier, implying that my grandmother had been senile and easily manipulated in her final months. They trotted out Jessica to give interviews about how worried they were about me, how they tried to help me over the years but I'd always been difficult and resistant to support. The narrative they constructed was designed to make me look unreliable and vindictive, to suggest that any evidence I provided should be viewed with extreme skepticism. But the evidence was too strong to be dismissed that easily. Other attorneys started filing additional suits as more victims came forward, each new complaint adding weight to the accusations. Regulatory agencies opened investigations into Mitchell and Associates' business practices, auditors started examining their financial records, reporters started digging into their history and finding patterns that corroborated what I'd revealed. What had started as a single lawsuit expanded into a comprehensive unraveling of my parents' business empire. And for the first time in their lives they were facing consequences they couldn't buy or charm their way out of. Through all of this I stayed in Austin, continuing my work with Angela's firm, trying to maintain some normalcy even as my past consumed increasing amounts of my time and energy. The legal process was exactly as difficult as Victoria had warned it would be. Depositions where opposing counsel tried to break me down, court appearances where I had to face my parents across a courtroom, media attention that made me feel constantly exposed and judged. But I had something I hadn't had 10 years earlier when they disowned me in a parking lot. I had a support system of people who believed in me, a career I was proud of, a sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on my parents' approval, and the certain knowledge that what I was doing was right even if it was hard. The day I walked into the Multnomah County Courthouse for the preliminary hearing on the workers' wage theft case, I wore a gray suit I'd bought specifically for court appearances and the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me in her will. I looked professional and put together, but more importantly, I felt strong and certain and ready for whatever came next. My parents sat on the opposite side of the courtroom with their expensive attorneys and their carefully maintained appearances, and when my mother caught my eye and smiled that familiar dismissive smile, I smiled back. Because this time I knew something she didn't. I had already won. Not the case, though I was confident we'd win that too, but the larger battle for my own soul and identity and right to exist in the world without apologizing for who I was. The preliminary hearing lasted 3 days, with testimony from former employees of Mitchell and Associates, who detailed the systematic wage theft they'd experienced. Workers described being paid for 40 hours when they'd worked 60, benefits promised but never delivered, overtime rates calculated incorrectly to save the company money. The pattern was clear and consistent across years and multiple projects, demonstrating that this wasn't occasional oversight but deliberate policy. My father's attorneys tried to argue that any discrepancies were the result of accounting errors, that a company as large as Mitchell and Associates inevitably had some administrative mistakes, that there was no proof of intentional wrongdoing. But Victoria Chun was methodical and relentless, walking the judge through the evidence my grandmother had collected. She showed emails where my father explicitly instructed his payroll manager to find ways to reduce labor costs, even if it meant creative interpretation of hour logs. She presented testimony from a former bookkeeper who'd quit after being asked to falsify timesheets, who'd kept her own copies of the original documents showing what hours workers had actually logged versus what they'd been paid for. She demonstrated that the so-called errors always benefited the company and never the workers, that they occurred too consistently and in too similar a pattern to be accidental. I sat in the gallery watching this unfold, seeing my father's confident facade begin to crack as the evidence mounted. He'd always been so certain of his own cleverness, so sure that his money and connections would protect him from consequences. Watching him realize that protection had limits, that documentation and testimony from credible witnesses could pierce through the shield of wealth and status, was surreal. My mother sat beside him maintaining her gracious expression, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped her purse too tightly. Jessica wasn't there for the hearing, probably advised by their attorneys that her presence wasn't helpful, that the optics of the whole family showing up like it was a social event rather than a legal proceeding would play poorly. The judge ruled at the end of the third day that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, and furthermore that the pattern of behavior demonstrated suggested potential criminal liability beyond the civil claims. He referred the case to the district attorney's office for review of possible charges of fraud and wage theft. My father's lead attorney objected strenuously, arguing that the judge was overstepping his authority, but the judge was unmoved. He said that when evidence of criminal activity was presented in his courtroom, he had an obligation to ensure appropriate authorities were notified, and that the defendants would have ample opportunity to defend themselves through proper channels. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, I was immediately surrounded by reporters shouting questions. How did I feel about the judge's ruling? What did I want to say to my parents? Was I satisfied with how the case was proceeding? I'd prepared a brief statement with Victoria's help, something that struck the right balance between confidence and respect for the ongoing legal process. I said that I was grateful the judge had recognized the seriousness of the allegations, that I hoped this case would bring justice for the workers who'd been exploited, and that I looked forward to the truth emerging through the legal system. I didn't mention my parents directly, or make any inflammatory comments that could be used against me later. But as I finished speaking and turned to leave, I saw them emerging from a different courthouse exit, their attorneys running interference with the press. My father looked older than I remembered, the stress of the past months evident in new lines around his eyes and mouth. My mother still looked impeccable, but there was something brittle in her perfection now, as if she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. For just a moment, our eyes met across the courthouse steps, and I saw something I'd never seen in her expression before. It wasn't quite fear, but it was close. It was the realization that she'd lost control of the narrative, that the careful image she'd spent decades crafting was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The months following that preliminary hearing were a cascade of consequences for my parents. The district attorney did pursue criminal charges, initially for wage theft and fraud related to the workers' claims, but then expanding as investigators dug deeper into Mitchell and Associates' business practices. The civil lawsuits multiplied as more victims found courage to come forward. Regulatory boards opened investigations into my father's professional licenses. Banks that had financed Mitchell and Associates projects began examining whether they'd been provided accurate information or if loan documents had been falsified. The carefully constructed empire my parents had built was being dismantled piece by piece, and everyone who'd ever been impressed by the Mitchell name was now watching them fall. The social consequences were almost as severe as the legal ones. Portland society, which had embraced my parents as pillars of the community, turned on them with the particular viciousness that comes from feeling deceived. Charity boards asked my mother to resign from positions she'd held for years. The country club where my father had been a member since his 20s quietly suggested he might be more comfortable elsewhere. Invitations to galas and fundraisers stopped arriving. Friends who'd socialized with them for decades suddenly became unavailable for lunch dates and golf outings. The social capital they'd accumulated over a lifetime evaporated almost overnight, replaced by scandal and speculation and schadenfreude. Jessica's engagement fell apart 3 months into the legal proceedings, her fiancé's family apparently deciding that association with the Mitchell name was now a liability rather than an asset. She tried to distance herself from our parents publicly, giving an interview where she claimed she'd had no knowledge of their business practices and was shocked and disappointed by the allegations. But the damage was done. Her social media presence, once full of enviable photos and aspirational content, became a target for critics pointing out that her lifestyle had been funded by fraud and exploitation. She eventually made all her accounts private and largely disappeared from public view. I watched all of this unfold from Austin, receiving updates from Victoria and following news coverage online, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing my parents face consequences for their actions, validation in having the truth I'd revealed be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. But there was also something that felt uncomfortably like grief for the family I'd never really had but had once hoped might exist. Even knowing everything I knew about how they treated me and others, some part of me still remembered being a child who'd loved her parents before she'd learned they didn't love her back. The trial itself took place almost 2 years after that first lawsuit was filed, by which point the accumulated evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented testimony from dozens of witnesses, documents showing a systematic pattern of fraud spanning more than a decade, expert analysis of financial records demonstrating intentional manipulation. My father's defense team tried to argue that he'd relied on advisors and managers to handle day-to-day operations, that he couldn't be held personally responsible for decisions made by subordinates. But the emails and recorded conversations made clear that he'd been intimately involved in decision-making, that he'd often been the one directing the fraudulent practices. My mother's role was murkier, as she'd never been an official employee of Mitchell and Associates, but the evidence showed she'd been aware of the illegal activities and had benefited from them. She was charged as an accessory, facing lesser penalties than my father but still significant consequences. During the trial, her attorney tried to paint her as a naive spouse who trusted her husband without questioning his business methods, but the jury seemed unimpressed with that characterization. The woman who'd built her identity on being sophisticated and socially skilled couldn't credibly claim ignorance about the source of the wealth that funded her lifestyle. I was called to testify, both about the evidence I provided and about my personal history with my parents. The prosecution wanted to establish that I had credibility as a witness, that despite being their daughter, I had legitimate reasons for coming forward that went beyond personal vendetta. I spent 6 hours on the witness stand over 2 days, being questioned by the prosecution about how I'd obtained the evidence, what I'd found in my grandmother's files, why I'd decided to bring it to authorities. Then I was cross-examined by my father's attorney, who tried to paint me as vindictive and unstable, who brought up my estrangement from the family as evidence of my unreliability. The cross-examination was brutal. Exactly the experience Victoria had prepared me for, but still difficult to endure. My father's attorney asked detailed questions about my mental health, about whether I'd ever been in therapy, about my reasons for leaving Portland after graduation. He tried to suggest that I'd always been jealous of Jessica, that I'd been angry about not being included in the family business, that I'd manufactured evidence because I couldn't accept that my parents had simply wanted me to be independent. Every question was designed to undermine my credibility, to make the jury doubt my motives and reliability. But Victoria had prepared me well, and I'd spent years in therapy working through my complicated feelings about my family. I answered each question calmly and directly, acknowledging that yes, I'd been in therapy because processing childhood trauma was healthy and responsible. Yes, I'd left Portland after my parents disowned me because staying in a city where I'd been rejected by my family was painful. Yes, I'd felt hurt by their treatment of me, but that my hurt didn't change the objective facts demonstrated by the documentary evidence. I explained that I hadn't needed to manufacture anything because the evidence spoke for itself, that my grandmother had collected it not because I'd asked her to but because she'd recognized wrongdoing and wanted someone to be able to address it eventually. The moment that shifted the entire trial came when the prosecution played one of the audio recordings from my grandmother's collection. It was from a family dinner about 8 years earlier when I was still in high school. My parents and several of their business associates were discussing a housing development project in a historically low-income neighborhood. The recording captured my father laughing about how they were technically required to include affordable units in the development, but they'd found a workaround through a shell company that would allow them to meet the letter of the law, while effectively pricing out the current residents. One of the associates asked if that was legal, and my father responded that it didn't matter what was legal, only what they could get away with. The courtroom was completely silent as that recording played. My father's attorney tried to object, arguing the recording was obtained illegally, but the judge overruled him, noting that Oregon is a one-party consent state and my grandmother had been present at the dinner. The jury heard my father in his own voice, explicitly stating that he didn't care about legality, only about what he could get away with. It was the kind of smoking gun that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away. The verdict came down after 3 days of deliberation. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud, wage theft, and conspiracy. My father faced up to 15 years in prison, my mother up to 5 years as an accessory. They were also ordered to pay millions in restitution to victims, and face civil penalties that would likely consume most of their remaining assets. The Mitchell family empire, built over decades through a combination of legitimate business and systematic fraud, was effectively destroyed. Properties would be sold to pay judgments, the company would be dissolved. The name that had once commanded respect in Portland would become synonymous with corruption and exploitation. I wasn't in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Having returned to Austin after my testimony concluded, Victoria called me as soon as it happened, her voice tight with professional satisfaction. She said we'd won, that justice had been served, that the case would likely become a landmark example of successful prosecution of white-collar crime. She said I should be proud of what I'd accomplished, that without my courage in coming forward none of this would have been possible. I thanked her for her work, ended the call, and sat in my Austin apartment feeling strangely empty. I'd spent years building toward this moment, preparing for this confrontation, working toward holding my parents accountable for their actions. Now that it had happened, now that they'd been found guilty and would face real consequences, I didn't feel the triumph or closure I'd expected. Instead, I felt exhausted and sad, grieving for the family I'd never had and the parents who'd chosen money and image over integrity and love. The win felt hollow somehow, justice served but nothing truly restored or healed. Angela found me at my desk the next day staring blankly at architectural drawings I was supposed to be reviewing. She asked if I was okay, if I wanted to talk about the verdict, if I needed time off to process everything. I told her I didn't know how I was supposed to feel, that I'd accomplished what I set out to do but it didn't feel the way I'd imagined. She sat down across from me and said something I've never forgotten. She said that justice isn't about feeling good. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard and complicated, and doesn't give you the satisfaction you think you deserve. She said that I'd given voice to people who'd been exploited, that I'd held powerful people accountable for their actions, that I'd demonstrated integrity even when it cost me personally. Whether or not it felt triumphant, it mattered. In the months after the verdict, I started to understand what she meant. I received letters from some of the workers who'd been awarded restitution through the civil settlements, thanking me for coming forward, telling me how much the money meant to their families, expressing gratitude that someone had finally held Mitchell and Associates accountable. A nonprofit focused on workers' rights asked me to speak at their annual conference about the importance of whistleblowers in exposing corporate fraud. A law school invited me to participate in a panel discussion about ethical responsibilities when you discover wrongdoing by family members. Gradually, I began to see the case as something larger than my personal story of parental rejection. It became about the broader principle that wealth and status shouldn't protect people from consequences of harmful behavior, that victims of exploitation deserve justice regardless of how powerful their exploiters are, that speaking truth about wrongdoing is worth the personal cost, even when that cost is high. My parents had taught me through their cruelty that appearance mattered more than substance, that image was everything, that being right was less important than being on top. In pursuing justice against them, I'd rejected everything they tried to teach me and had proven the opposite, that substance mattered more than appearance, that truth was more valuable than image, that integrity was worth more than power. 5 years after that graduation day in Portland, I stood in a different courthouse for a different kind of proceeding. This time I was there to formally establish the Warren Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal and financial support for workers pursuing claims against employers who'd exploited them. I was funding it partially with money from my grandmother's estate, partially with donations from people who'd followed the Mitchell case and wanted to support the cause. The foundation would provide free legal consultation, help with gathering evidence, financial assistance during lengthy legal proceedings, and advocacy for stronger worker protection laws. The foundation was everything my parents' legacy was not. Where they had built wealth through exploitation, the foundation would work to protect the exploited. Where they had used power to avoid accountability, the foundation would help the powerless seek accountability. Where they had valued image over substance, the foundation would value truth over appearance. It felt like the right way to honor my grandmother's memory, and to make meaning out of the painful journey I'd been on since that parking lot conversation 10 years earlier. At the foundation launch event, surrounded by labor advocates and attorneys and workers who'd survived exploitation, I gave a short speech about why this work mattered. I talked about how systems of power often protect those at the top while leaving those at the bottom vulnerable. I talked about how speaking up against wrongdoing by people we're supposed to trust and respect requires courage, but also creates change. I talked about how justice is rarely easy or satisfying, but is always worth pursuing. I didn't mention my parents by name or detail my personal history, because this wasn't about them anymore. It was about building something positive from the wreckage of their choices, about using the pain they'd caused as motivation to prevent others from experiencing similar harm. After the event, an older woman approached me, introducing herself as someone who'd worked for Mitchell and Associates 20 years ago. She said she'd been injured on a job site and had tried to file a workers' compensation claim, but the company had fought it aggressively, and she'd eventually given up because she couldn't afford to keep fighting. She said watching the trial and seeing my father held accountable had given her a sense of validation she hadn't realized she needed, confirmation that the injustice she'd experienced had been real and wrong. She thanked me for my courage and said she hoped the foundation would help others avoid what she'd gone through. We talked for almost an hour, and when she left I felt something shift inside me, a sense that maybe the painful journey had been worth it after all. My parents served their sentences at different facilities, my father at a federal prison in California, my mother at a minimum security facility in Washington. I didn't visit either of them or maintain any contact. Some people asked if I felt guilty about that, if I worried about them or wished things could be different. The honest answer was no. They'd made choices that led them to where they were, the same way I'd made choices that led me to where I was. The difference was that my choices had been guided by principles of integrity and justice, while theirs had been guided by greed and vanity. I didn't owe them my sympathy or my presence or my forgiveness, and I'd learned through years of therapy that you don't have to forgive people just because they're family. Jessica reached out to me once about 3 years after the verdict. She sent an email that was carefully worded, probably reviewed by a therapist or attorney. She said she understood why I'd done what I'd done, that she recognized our parents had treated me unfairly, that she was sorry for her part in their cruelty toward me. She said she'd spent a lot of time in therapy working through her own issues about our family, that she'd come to realize how toxic the environment we'd grown up in had been, that she hoped maybe someday we could have some kind of relationship. The email felt sincere in a way Jessica had never been before, suggesting maybe she really had done the work of self-examination and growth. I thought about responding for several weeks, drafting and deleting multiple versions of what I might say. In the end, I sent a brief reply thanking her for reaching out, acknowledging that our childhood had been damaging for both of us in different ways, but explaining that I wasn't interested in rebuilding a relationship with anyone from that chapter of my life. I wished her well in her own healing journey, but I made clear that my healing required maintaining distance from the family that had caused me so much pain. She didn't respond to that message, and I didn't hear from her again. It felt like a door closing, final but not angry, just a clear boundary about what I was and wasn't willing to have in my life going forward. 10 years after that graduation day, I stood in front of a group of architecture students at the University of Texas giving a guest lecture about socially conscious design. I talked about how buildings and spaces shape the lives of the people who use them, how thoughtful architecture can promote community and equity, while careless design can reinforce inequality and isolation. I showed examples of projects my firm had completed: affordable housing that was beautiful and dignified, community centers that served as anchors for struggling neighborhoods, public spaces that welcomed everyone regardless of income or status. The students asked smart questions about balancing idealism with economic reality, about how to maintain ethical standards in an industry often driven by profit, about whether it was possible to make a living while still doing meaningful work. After the lecture, a young woman approached me during the reception. She introduced herself as a first-year graduate student, said she'd followed the Mitchell case closely, and wanted to thank me for showing that it was possible to stand up to powerful people who did wrong. She said her own family had expectations for her that didn't align with her values, that they wanted her to go into corporate law while she wanted to focus on public interest work, that they'd threatened to cut her off financially if she didn't follow their plan. She asked how I'd found the courage to choose my own path, even when it meant losing my family's support. I thought carefully about my answer, wanting to give her something honest and useful rather than platitudes. I told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting according to your values despite fear. I said that losing my family had been devastating, that there were still moments when I felt the grief of that loss, but that compromising my integrity to maintain their approval would have been worse. I told her that building a life aligned with your values takes time and effort and often requires sacrifice, but that the peace that comes from knowing you're living authentically is worth more than any amount of money or family approval. I said that she had to decide for herself what mattered most, that no one could make that choice for her, but that choosing integrity over convenience rarely led to regret even when it led to hardship. She thanked me with tears in her eyes, and I recognized something of my younger self in her. That desperate need for permission to be yourself, for confirmation that choosing your own path was okay even when authority figures disapproved. I gave her my contact information and told her to reach out if she ever needed advice or support, that sometimes having someone further down a similar path could make the journey feel less lonely. She became one of several young people I've mentored over the years, people struggling with family expectations or ethical dilemmas, or the challenge of building meaningful careers in fields that don't always value meaning over profit. The work with the foundation and my firm became deeply intertwined, each informing the other. Designing spaces for vulnerable populations while also advocating for the workers who built those spaces felt like a complete expression of the values I'd developed through my own struggles. I'd learned firsthand what it felt like to be devalued and dismissed, to have your worth determined by criteria that had nothing to do with your actual qualities or capabilities. That experience shaped everything about how I approached both my professional work and my advocacy, creating a commitment to dignity and fairness that went beyond abstract principles to lived reality. Looking back on the decades since my parents disowned me in that parking lot, I can see how every difficult moment led somewhere necessary. The rejection that felt like it would destroy me actually freed me to become myself. The evidence my grandmother left me, which could have been a burden of revenge, became instead a tool for justice. The pain of losing my family opened space for me to build chosen family with people who valued me for who I actually was rather than who they wanted me to be. The courtroom victory that felt hollow at first became meaningful, as I watched its ripple effects help others find their own justice. My life now looks nothing like what my parents wanted for me, and that's exactly as it should be. I'm not married to someone from a prominent family. I don't attend society galas or serve on prestigious boards. I don't live in a mansion or drive a luxury car, or wear designer clothes. Instead, I do work that matters with people I respect. I live in a home I chose because it felt right rather than because it impressed anyone. I spend my time on projects that align with my values rather than projects that enhance my status. I'm building a legacy based on integrity rather than image, on substance rather than appearance, on truth rather than careful presentation. The girl who stood in that parking lot 10 years ago would barely recognize the woman I've become. That girl was still hoping for her parents' approval, still measuring herself against their standards, still believing somewhere deep down that maybe if she achieved enough or became enough they might finally see her value. This woman knows her value isn't determined by anyone else's assessment, that approval from people who lack integrity isn't worth pursuing, that the only standards that matter are the ones she sets for herself. The transformation wasn't easy or quick, but it was necessary and ultimately liberating. Sometimes I still think about my parents, wonder how they're doing, whether prison changed them or just made them bitter. I wonder if they ever understood what they'd lost when they chose image over love, status over decency, appearance over substance. I wonder if they have regrets, if they wish they'd made different choices, if they recognize the direct line between their values and their downfall. But mostly I don't wonder about them at all, because they're no longer the center of my story. They're just the painful beginning that made the rest possible. The darkness that taught me to recognize and build toward light. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.